All right, so in the last video, we were exploring how to take an Excel object, put it into a PowerPoint presentation, but how we could paste it differently in there. And by pasting it differently, we could do things like set links to it or paste it as a picture or an embedded Excel object. So a lot of cool things. But in this video, we're going to now assume that we know how to paste things, and we're now going to look at how we can set the dimensions of our shapes. So for example, the height and the width, and then like if we want it to be aligned a certain way in our slide from the top and the left side of our slide. So in my workbook, I've already got some data, and that data is feeding into this chart. So I'm going to go into my Excel VBA editor. And so when you're looking at this, this should look really familiar with you. If this does not look familiar at all, please go watch the other videos, because all this is doing is taking an object from our Excel workbook and exporting it into a PowerPoint presentation. So I'm not going to explain how this code works, because I've already done that in another video, and I go line by line what we're doing at each line and how it works. In this video, we're going to keep it simple. We're just going to talk about aligning shapes. Now, I will still say, because again, we're working with PowerPoint objects, you still have to have that library enabled. So remember, to enable the PowerPoint object library, we go up to Tools, we go down to References, and then we want to make sure that this library is enabled. So the Microsoft PowerPoint object library. And then once it's enabled, we can start writing our script. Now the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to declare another object variable. This one's going to be called PPT shape. And I know it shocks everyone, but it actually is a shape object. And so this is, again, it's going to be like almost like a container almost. And it's going to allow us to reference a shape in our slide. And then once we've created that reference, we can set different properties about it. And we can even call different methods about it. So it's just an easier way to work with our objects. And then once I've done that, I'm going to rerun my script just to make sure it works and to also explain some concepts. Great, it worked. So I've copied an object in here, but now I want to set certain dimensions about it. Well, there's 4 dimensions I can set. The first 2 are the height and width of my object. So for example, the height, so this is how tall my object is. So if I go down vertically, that's my height. I've got my width, that's just how wide my object is. So I can go from left to right, that's the width. And there's 2 other ones. There's another one called left. Well, that's saying, starting from the left point of my slide, how far in is my object from the left? So this distance right here, so the blank space between the left of my slide to my object, that's the left. I can set that distance, I can set that as a property. And then the final dimension is the top. So that's saying, starting at the top of my slide, how far down is my object? So starting at the top of the slide, how far down is my object? So right here, all this kind of empty space, that would be considered the top. And it kind of makes sense, because remember, we're working on a 2-dimensional plane. And so it's like we kind of have another plane on another plane. But those are the different properties we can set about it. And how we set those properties is, the first thing I got to do is I've got to first set a reference to my shape. So I'm going to say set a reference to the shape I want to manipulate. Well, we've done this before. We just set a PPT shape object equal to, we go into our PowerPoint slide object, and then we go in the shapes collection that belongs to that slide. So the shapes collection is it's the group of all the shapes on that slide, on that particular slide. And then what I can do is I can basically put some brackets, and I can reference an individual shape. So just up here where I'm referencing a chart, I'm referencing a shape in my slide. So let me run my code again, because again, I really want to make sure you guys are getting this. I currently have two shapes on my slide. I've got a text box and I've got this chart object. I added this chart object second. So this has an index of 2. My text box, that has an index of 1. So as we add shapes, our index will go up, and so the later shapes have a higher index, where my earlier shapes have a lower index. This was the second shape I added, so it's got an index of 2. I'm going to close my presentation again. Now that I've set a reference to my shape, I can manipulate the properties about that shape. So I'm going to set the left, top, height, and width of my shape. So I'm going to say with the PowerPoint shape that I referenced above, set the left equal to, let's do 200, the top equal to 200, the height equal to 300, and the width equal to 300 as well. And I'm going to close my end width block. Width. So let's see what happens after we've done all that. Cool. So it took our shape and it set the height and width, and then it also positioned it. So now it's, 200 down and 200 left. So pretty cool. So not too complicated, but let's just say, for example, we didn't want to have to type this in every time, right? Because that's kind of annoying. Well, there's another way we can do this. I'm going to take this code again. I'm going to copy it. I'm going to call this method. Can't spell tonight. Method 2. And I'm going to add one more variable. I'm going to call this shape count. And that's just going to be an integer. And then what I want to do is, I know this is the second shape on my slide, and I know I only have 2 shapes. So what if I could just count the number of shapes on my slide? Because if I always know that I'm working with the latest object on my slide, well, I just got to count the number of shapes, and then I should be good to go, right? Exactly. So there's nothing wrong with that. So how we do that is, I'm going to say shape count equals PPT slide, go in the shapes collection, and then there's a method that I can call, not a method, a property that I can call, that is count. So this will count the number of shapes on my slide. Well, there's only 2 shapes, so this is going to return a 2. So I can just, instead of putting a 2, I can just say, hey, put the shape count there. And now let's see what we get. Let's see if it still takes that chart object and manipulates it. Hey, it still manipulates it. So that's good. So now we see a second method for doing that. So, if we wanted to make it a little bit more robust, and we're just saying, hey, like maybe, we're just going to add slides, or shapes, what would that look like? But there's also something else that we can do. What happens if I want to center my object and I want to, put it in the middle of my slide? How would I do that? Well, there's a couple ways we can do it. One's an easy way, and then another is very difficult, and I don't like doing it, but I think it's important to show you it. So, for example, this one. I want to center and align this object. So I want it to be, here's me dragging it, just like that, right? Well, how would I do that? Well, I know the center of my slide. I just got to take my slide width, divide that by 2, and then I'll get to my center. And then my slide middle, I just got to take my height, so this height of my slide, and cut that in half, and then I'm in my middle. And then what I've got to do, this is kind of where people get a little bit tricked up when they see it. They're like, wait a minute, I didn't think about that. I'm like, I know. We want to set the left property. Well, what's the left property in this case? What would the left be? Well, it's really from the center of it, so we've got the center, but really I need my distance to be from here to here. So really it's like I'm taking my object and cutting it in half, and I'm saying, really, make my left equal to half the slide width, and then minus half of my shape object width. And the same applies for the middle. Take half of my slide height, and then take half of my object height and subtract that from it. So that way I can set my top property. So how would we do that? I wish there was an easy way to get the slide height. Well, lucky for us, there is. We'll call this method 3. And let's do this. So let's say I'm here. I'm going to delete that. And let's see, I'll keep that here. I'll just delete that. And then from here, let's assume that I wanted to align it. So first thing is I got to get slide height and slide width. Well, lucky for us, there's a really easy way to do that. So I'm going to create a variable called slide height. And that's going to equal the PPT_pres object, so our presentation. And in that presentation, there is a page setup property. And then within that property, there is something called slide height. So that will tell me the height of my slide. I'm going to do a couple more things. Just to be responsible, I'm going to declare a couple more variables. Slide height, slide middle, shape middle, shape center. And then technically there is a slide middle and a slide center. Okay. And then from here I've got to get my slide width. Well, it's identical, so I'm going to call my PPT_pres object, go into the page setup property. But now there is a slide width. Instead of the slide height, I want the slide width. And then from here, I've got to calculate the middle and center of my slide. So my slide center, well, we know that that's just taking the slide height and dividing that by 2, and then we know the slide, oh wait, not slide height, we want the slide width, my bad, it's the slide width, remember it's the width of the slide divided by 2. And then for the slide middle, we want the slide height divided by 2. If you can't already tell, this is why I don't like this method. It's really easy to get your math or your height and your width mixed up, and it's like, it just gets hectic, and I don't like it. So that's that. So I got my slide center, my slide middle. Now I need to calculate the center of my shape, center and middle of my shape. So that's almost identical to up here, but instead now I'm going to say, okay, shape middle is equal to the PPT shape, and then I still need the height, not the has chart, the height, and I still need to divide that by 2. And then the shape center is equal to the PPT shape, and then we know that there is a height, a width property about it, and we want to divide that by 2. Now from here, we have all the pieces of information to align our shape. So I'm going to say with PPT shape, what I want the left to be is I want it to be equal to the slide center minus the shape center. And then I want the top to be equal to the slide width, slide middle, minus the shape middle. And then I'm going to end the width statement. So this will align my shape to the center and middle of my slide. So let's see if doing all that produces the results that we want. Oh, I put it twice. That wasn't good. Height, we'll call that width. Okay, so cool. Now our shape is now aligned to the center in the middle of our slide. Great, it worked. It was messy, but it worked. Let's work with an easier way, because that's what we want to do. We don't want to have to make this a super complicated process every time we want to align one of our shapes. So, in the PowerPoint object library, there is an object called shape range. So just like we can have a range of cells that contains a bunch of different cells, we can have a range of shapes. And so with this range of shapes, we can basically, there's a little trick in there, but basically there's a method called align, and that align method will align it to the middle of the the middle of the slide or the center of the slide. And so we don't have to do any of this crazy calculations that we were doing up here and then align our shape. We can just call those methods, and then there's another property that says, hey, do you want it aligned to the middle of another object or to the slide? Well, we want it to the slide in this example, so we're going to set that property equal to true, because by setting it equal to true, we are saying, hey, align it to the center in the middle of our slide. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to change this variable right here. I'm going to copy it. And now with this one, I'm going to declare something called a shape range. And this shape range can house different shapes. I'm going to get rid of all this, because that's the ugly way of doing it. And so I'm going to keep this. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this line of code. So I'm going to say ppt.shapeRange. And so the shape range is going to belong to a ppt slide object. So it's going to belong to a slide. Each slide has their own range of shapes. And what I can do is I can go in the shapes collection, and then there's something called a range method, and that range method allows me to put a bunch of my shapes into a shape range. And so I like to pass through an array, because a shape range, technically you have the ability to have multiple shapes in there. So for example, like, hey, I want to take a bunch of shapes and set the background color of it, then you can actually put in multiple shapes. Now, in this example, I'm just putting in one shape, and that's going to be the second shape. So I'm just going to leverage what I did up here and just say, hey, count the number of shapes, because I know it's the second one. But now that second shape, instead of being assigned to a shape object, it's going to be assigned to a shape range object. So now we're going to be able to leverage the method and properties of a shape range. And we'll find this is really nice and really easy. So after I've done that, I can set the dimensions of my shape range. So I'm going to say with ppt shape range. What I want to do is I want to set the height equal to 300, the width equal to 300. Let me try to put it up like that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, there's also this other cool method. Sorry, it was just, I thought it was acting up a little bit. Hold on, I want to check something. Oh, I see. I didn't change that to a 3. I knew something because IntelliSense wasn't coming up. I'm like, wait a minute, something's going on. So let me do this. Okay, so now it works. So I can set the align method, or I can call my align method, and I can say, okay, put it to the middle of my slide. And by setting the true property, I'm saying the middle of my slide, not the middle of another object in my shape range. And I'm going to call the align method again, but this time I want it to be in the center. And again, I want it to be to the slide, not to the other object. I want to end my with statement. So let's see if by doing all that, it fixes kind of all that mess that we had to do up here. Oh, misspelled. Gotta love IntelliSense. Okay. Bam. So again, align to the center in the middle of my slide, and it set the height and the width. But look at it. We didn't have to write any of this. We just had to basically add 2 extra lines to that, because instead of using a shape now, we were just using a shape range, and it saved us a bunch of time. So that's really cool. That actually makes our lives a lot easier. There's actually one final method I'm going to show you. And so this is another common way that people kind of manipulate shapes. And I like it. I think it's a good way to do it. But what we can do is I can actually get rid of a lot of this now. It's probably the simplest out of all of it, to be honest. What I can do is I can get rid of that line. I can get rid of that too. So there's actually something called an active window within PowerPoint. So we consider that active window like the one that we're seeing on our screen. And within that, there's a selection. And so that selection says, hey, any of the shapes or any of the items that you have selected in that window. And so what I can do is by calling the selection aspect of it, I can actually take the objects that I have selected and I can put them into a shape range. So it kind of helps skip the step of just saying, hey, formally declare a shape range. And it says, hey, whatever I have in there, just put it into a shape range and then manipulate it going forward. And so it's nice because we don't have to do that. But again, it's assuming that you've selected that shape in the slide. And so what I have to do is after I paste my shape, I now have to select my shape. And then after that, now I can set the dimensions of the selected shape in my active window. Here's something you really got to keep in mind. We are operating from within Excel. We have to be very explicit about which active window we are talking about. So some mistakes that I always made, I would always make this one. It drove me crazy because I'm like, everyone online says it's right. This one, active window, dot selection, dot shape range. This will return an error because guess what? Well, it doesn't return an error per se, but it's not going to get us the right result because we're not specifying which application we're talking about. We have 2 applications opened, Excel and PowerPoint. We've got to be explicit. We have to say, go to the PowerPoint application and go to that active window, and then whatever shapes you have selected, put those shapes into the shape range. It's so important that you understand that because that caused me such a headache when I was first learning how to do this because it's not really clear. And a lot of times you'll go online and they have all these code resources, but they're assuming that you're talking from within PowerPoint. We're not. We're talking from within Excel. And so now that I've done that, I can set my height equal to 300, my width equal to 300. And again, I can call my align method and just say, hey, put it to the center of my slide. And then I can call it again. And this time say, put it into the middle of my slide. But you can all see there's left, right, bottom, top. I mean, it really does make our lives a lot easier. I really like this align method. And then, again, just set it equal to true. I want it to the slide. So let's run it now and see what we get. Oh, did I put it to the wrong one? Oh, that's why. I put it to right. I need it to middles. Well, now you see how the right method works too. There we go. That looks better. So great. So this is using the selection method. I call it the selection method, but it's assuming, hey, I want to manipulate the active selection that I have selected after I've pasted it. So again, really great tool. I love it. If at all possible, try to use shape ranges. That is just so much easier than doing all of this. It's a lot of extra calculation. I don't like doing that. The only time I would really use a shape is, again, if I knew beforehand really what it was, I would do this. But if it was something where I wanted to align and center those objects, just use a shape range. It's going to be a little bit easier. But other than that, that concludes this video. So if you have any questions about this video, or if you want to kind of get into more detail about like maybe what we could do, feel free, comment below. I'll try to get back to you and answer some of your questions. If you've got like, hey, there's something that I'm trying to get a better understanding of, I'll try to answer that as well. Or hey, if you got recommendations for another video, by all means, put them down there. I'll definitely go and do the research and see what we can do with it, especially if something that people, a lot of people are interested in. Yeah, so thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.